Hi, I'm Roger Maldonado, President of the New York City Bar Association, and thank you all for joining us this evening. As some of you may know, the first installment of this series involved a conversation with United States Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and United States Justice Sonia Sotomayor. And that is a very, very tough act to follow. Fortunately, this lecture series was both conceived and sponsored by Barbara Paul Robinson, who is trying to hide right over there, the first woman president of this association. Barbara's a retired partner at Debevoise and Plimpton, and someone who always looks forward to a challenge, and once again, she has not only risen to it, she has met it and gone beyond it by having tonight Ken Frazier and Conrad Harper as our guests who will engage in a conversation. Barbara's vision for this evening, in fact, was exactly that there be a frank and open conversation between persons of prominence in, not just the city and the state of New York, but in the United States, and who would then tell us about their journeys. And what a great choice, and again, Barbara is behind who does participate in these series. Barbara made for tonight's conversation. Ken Frazier has been a major figure in both business and law for many years. He leads Merck Co, Inc., one of the world's largest pharmaceutical companies, as its chairman and CEO, after having served as the company's general counsel and being a distinguished partner at the Philadelphia firm Drinker Biddle. We were joking before coming up that Ken still calls himself a Philadelphia lawyer. And I responded, well, that's still better than a Court Street lawyer, for which I was one for some years when I was first in legal services. Conrad Harper served as president of the New York City Bar Association from 1988 to 1990, and is the first African-American lawyer to do so. For many years, he was a partner at Simpson Thacher. And Conrad, I'm told that you've been telling everyone here that tonight's star is Ken and that the whole conversation must be about him. But I know there are a lot of people in this room that would like to hear about your own path also. I'm just saying. Now retired, Conrad continues to lend his tireless devotion and wealth of experience to the well-being of the legal profession in New York, as well as to numerous other worthy causes. The bios of these incredible individuals are on the program, so I won't go through Ken and Conrad's many accomplishments. What's obvious, though, is that they have excelled as they forged their careers in the legal profession. But even those bios are abridged and don't tell the full story of the paths they have followed. I hope that tonight we will learn more about their paths. We're grateful that you are here with us tonight for this special evening, and with that, I turn the conversation over to Conrad and Ken.
Thank you, Roger, very much. So, Ken, let's begin at the beginning. Place of birth, parents, siblings, schooling.
So first of all, I want to thank you all for coming out tonight. And this is now the beginning of spring. So there's probably a lot of fun things you could be doing other than listening to me drone on, so I'll try to make it interesting. I was born in 1954, December 1954. That's significant because I was born just a few months after the Brown versus Board of Education decision. My parents both, lived in Philadelphia. My father was an extraordinary human being in the sense that he was born in the year 1900, and so if he were here today, he would be about to turn 119 years old. So he was 54 when I was born. The significance of that is that he had watched significant change occur in the United States, and although he had only 3 years of what passed for an education for an African-American child in South Carolina between 1906 and 1909, he immigrated to Philadelphia as a teenager around 14, 15 years of age, and he was self-taught. He read 2 newspapers a day. What he was denied in society, the opportunities he was denied in societies, he insisted that my siblings and I had to take advantage of, that there was no two ways about it, that that America had started to open doors, that it wasn't perfect by any means, but that we were obliged to live out a narrative that he would explain to us, because his father, my paternal grandfather, Richard Frazier, was born into slavery in 1857. And my father lived his entire life in awe of his father, because his father, who could not read or write, made the decision that he would send my father north rather than have him become indebted to the land, which was the custom in South Carolina. So my father's view of the world is that every opportunity that he had was because this man made this decision to send him north. He always asked, how could a person who lived his entire life on essentially the plantation that he was born on, how could he ever have the thought, the vision to send him north? And his view was that it had to be, imprinted in his brain by God, his spirit by God. And so as we grew up, my mother died when I was very young. I talked a lot about my father. My mother died when we were very young children, so I was raised by a single-parent father. I always say about my father, he was a caring but unsentimental parent. and everything that I am today is a result of the fact that he had a very hard and fast view of what my opportunities were.
And you have siblings?
I do. My younger sister, Carol, is a concert pianist. My older brother, Robert, is a now retired social worker. And I have half siblings who are, 5 of them, who are significantly older than me.
Your schooling before college, what was that?
So I went to the Philadelphia Public Schools, but once again, I mentioned that I'm a Brown baby. And I guess that really can actually be extended to what happened to me. I grew up in the inner city of Philadelphia, North Philadelphia to be specific. But again, chronologically, I came of age at a time when the social engineers of Philadelphia decided to experiment in what they called school desegregation. So the youngest of my father's 9 children, my sister and I, were chronologically at a stage where we were put on a bus and made to ride across town, much to our chagrin, because our friends always went to the local public schools and friendships deepened in the schoolyards, and we were always outside that. Looking back on that, I realized that those social engineers, those people I never met who wanted to experiment with school desegregation, gave me an opportunity to get a rigorous education that was not necessarily available in my neighborhood. And so, again, a lot of what I want to talk about tonight is social justice. And I know that, again, in addition to being born in a house with superb parents, a lot of what's happened to me is the result of some decisions made by people that I never met who put me on a bus and sent me to a school where the ambient standards of education were higher than they would have otherwise have been.
Then there came a time when you decided to go to college. How did that come about?
Well, that's an interesting story, too. I mean, at least I think it's interesting. You guys may think it's boring. I was going to college, I guess chronologically that is, in 1970. I was applying to college. And my aunt, who was a funeral director in our neighborhood, was very good friends with our local congressman, Robert N.C. Nix Sr., who was one of the few African Americans serving in the Congress at that time. And at that time, they had an appointment system in Congress where Congress people could appoint people to the military academies. And Congressman Nix and my Aunt Isabel had a conversation, and she said, I have the kid in this neighborhood who you can appoint to West Point or the Naval Academy. It's my nephew, the kid who had to ride the buses all the time. And so I met with the congressman. He came to my father's house and sat in my father's house, a very humble house in the inner city, and explained what a great, great, great honor it would be for our family if I was appointed to West Point or the Naval Academy. And so things started to move because my father was persuaded that this was the greatest thing that could have ever happened to the family. I applied to both academies. I was admitted to both. I decided to go to West Point. And I got a letter around November of 1970, and I can still remember opening that envelope. It was from the commandant at West Point, and he said, Dear Mr. Frazier, upon reviewing your records closely, we now realize that you are 15 years old. Because I had skipped several grades, and in my mind's eye, I was a high schooler. But it never occurred to me that you had to be 17 to be inducted into the Army. And with that excuse, I went to my father, because I make the point, in 1970, there was a war going on. And I wasn't exactly fond of going into the military at that time, but again, the pressure to do something for my family was so great. But after that letter came, I went to my father and I said, do I really have to go to 2 years of finishing school in order to go into the Army? And he agreed that that was not the case, and he said, you should go wherever you want. And I chose Penn State for a very sound reason. At that time, Penn State had the longest college football winning streak in the country of 33 games, and so I decided I would go to Penn State.
And
by the way, I will say that in those days, parents weren't as pushy about where their kids went to school. But I don't want to get into that.
And while at Penn State, what were the things that interested you both academically and otherwise, besides football?
Well, I went initially as a chemistry major. I wanted to be a scientist and was a chemistry major for my first year and a half until I ran into organic chemistry and decided that there was another path possible. And I then switched to political science, because in the back of my mind, I'd always wanted to consider a career in the law. I grew up at a time when, certain lawyers, I would use Thurgood Marshall as an exemplar of that, but, also people who were more proximate to me, like Bill Coleman, who I had the opportunity to work with later in my career. Those were big heroes of mine, and that was a time when lawyers were making major social change in our country, Brown being an exemplar of that, but going on from that. And so I decided that I would switch from sort of a science orientation to more of a history, political science, pre-law type orientation, with the goal of going to law school at some point. And as for the other things that I was interested in during my college years, I'll simply take the fifth.
Did you go directly to law school after college?
I did. I went directly to Harvard Law School after graduating from Penn State. That was in the fall of 1975.
Was there a particular reason you chose Harvard?
Because it was Harvard, and my family thought that I should, go to a law school that had a brand name, and it was just, frankly, one of those experiences that made a huge difference in my life. It wasn't always easy. I see Ted Wells out there, who was a great mentor of mine at Harvard Law School. I was 15 when I was on my way to college. I was awfully young going to law school and was poorly behaved. And frankly, it's good to have some adult supervision, and people like Ted Wells and Ken Chenault, who was at the law school at the time, provided that adult supervision.
And what about the summers between first and second years and second and third years? What did you do?
So, when I went to law school, I didn't know when I matriculated at Harvard Law School that large law firms existed. The only lawyers that I knew were the lawyers that practiced in my neighborhood in North Philadelphia. They were generally solo practitioners who did everything, real estate, criminal law. And I thought that's what lawyers were, right? I didn't know that there were these large firms composed of hundreds of lawyers who represented corporations. But when I got there, I realized that that was, in fact, a lot of what people did, and that was what, a fair amount of the expectation was for, young lawyers coming out of Harvard Law School. I remember I tell my wife all the time, I went to Filene's basement. I bought the first suit I had owned in my entire life in order to interview with law firms. It was a very shiny suit. And I walked into those interviews, and I wonder what those hiring partners thought of me. By the way, there were platform shoes that went with it, too. And so I guess to answer your question, I came back to Philadelphia, and I was a summer clerk at the law firm of Drinker, Biddle, and Reith.
For both summers?
For both summers, actually.
And so after law school, you're pretty clear you're going to Drinker Biddle.
I really thought it was clear. I interviewed all the firms in Philadelphia and a couple of firms outside Philadelphia, but I was really, really attracted to Drinker Biddle because they stressed their involvement in pro bono work up front.
And that leads naturally to the question of what kind of practice did you have at Drinker Biddle, and how much of it was pro bono?
Well, when I first went to the firm, so I decided that I wanted to be a trial lawyer. That was my ambition. largely because that was my conception of what lawyers did, was they went into court and they represented individuals, not just companies. And also, as my wife, Andrea, who's in the front row, will tell you, I suffer from attention deficit disorder. And so I always found going from matter to matter in the way in which litigation allowed me to do, to be something that I like more than having a real depth of understanding in something like tax or corporate. So I went there and I started practicing law there and did an awful lot of pro bono work while I was at the firm. In fact, when I left to go to Merck, one of my partners said, "You have a lot of nerve. You didn't do any billable work when you were here." But I felt like I got the best of that, too.
One of the cases you had at the firm involved James Willie Bo Cochran. Tell us about that.
So Bo was on death row in Alabama. He had been on death row for at that time, about 10 or 11 years for a crime that he committed, according to the state. It turns out that he didn't commit the crime. And he was a couple of weeks, 3 weeks away from his date, and I got a call from a truly great person named Esther Lardant, who ran at that time the ABA's Post-Conviction Death Penalty Project. And she'd called all around and couldn't get a lawyer, and so she called me on a Friday afternoon and she said, "It's now at the stage, Kenny," because that was my name, "Kenny, if you don't take this case, this man is going to be executed without representation." And honestly, it was at a time when I had a new baby at home, and I wasn't really eager to take on another pro bono case, but the guilt got me, and I agreed to at least go down and meet my client, interview him, and at least take on the case to the point where we were going to litigate the stay. The state of Alabama was not going to agree to a stay simply because now I had come in and entered appearance for this person. And so we litigated that case, the stay. We got a stay, and there began the greatest adventure of my entire life, which was understanding what that case was about. We litigated that case for about 5 years. We fought hard to get relief first on the penalty phase because he had gotten absolutely appallingly bad representation at every stage of the proceeding. And eventually we got the judge, who was a fantastic judge. You'll know him. Sam Pointer was our judge. Mm-hmm. If you got to get a judge in the Northern District of Alabama, it doesn't get any better than the late Sam Pointer was. And then fortunately, we were able to overcome the procedural default jurisprudence, which says it's very hard when certain issues were not raised in a particular way in the case to get those issues, to get jurisdiction of those issues in the federal courts. We were able, through some fairly arcane arguments, to get a Batson claim in front of the district court judge, and eventually he let us take some discovery on the underlying issue of guilt and innocence. And I'm not exaggerating to say that this was a person that absolutely could not possibly be on death row. In fact, even if he committed the crime that the state said he committed, that crime was not death eligible at the time. That's how bad his representation was. He was on the row for, at that time, I'm boring you a little bit, but Alabama had a felony murder statute which had been declared unconstitutional by the United States Supreme Court. So they shoehorned him into a part of the Alabama Penal Code that said that what was death eligible was a robbery in which the witnesses were killed intentionally, a very common thing. But the facts of the case were, even under the state's theory, my client had committed the robbery. And by the way, I should let you know, from the very moment I met my client, the first time, he said, "I committed that robbery, but I did not shoot anybody." And he said, "If you investigate this, you will find that the decedent," he didn't use that word, was shot by the police in an accidental misidentification. And it took us about 5 years to get discovery on the underlying facts of the case. But one of the greatest moments of my life was this killing happened in a trailer park in the dark. And the trailer park had been sold many times over in the interim period. And we have finally found the records of people who were living there at the time. And there was a gentleman who had moved to Texas from Alabama. And we knocked on his door. I will never forget. He said, I have been waiting for this for 8 years because I know what happened that night, and I know exactly why this happened. And he described what happened, and it was exactly what my client had told me 5 years prior when we were meeting for the first time on death row in Alabama.
You represented him both at the firm and at Merck.
Absolutely.
And how were you able to persuade Merck to go along?
Well, I have to say, Merck is an extraordinary company. It has a very strong ethos around justice, social justice, in terms of how we use our resources in the medical field. But the general counsel of Merck, who I worked for when I first went, there was a woman named Mary McDonald, and she was a legal services lawyer before she came to Merck. She was actually a Reggie scholar at legal services. And so when I was leaving the firm, I was very clear with her and then the CEO, Roy Vagelos, that this was my client. There's no way I could drop this matter in the middle of this litigation. And they accepted that and actually were very excited about that. So I'm quite sure that I'm the only person that's ever tried a death penalty case in-house.
Let's circle back to your leaving the firm and going to Merck. How did that come about? Why did you make the change?
Well, I love the private practice of law. I love my firm. But Merck was one of my billable clients. I didn't have a lot of them, but Merck was one of them. And I did a lot of work for Merck, and I got a call one day from the general counsel who said, why don't you come and meet with me and the CEO, a guy named Roy Vagelos, and we'd like to talk to you about coming to Merck. And, you know, of course, it's a big client. You don't say no. You go. And I said, I'll go and I'll go through the motions because I really love being a partner. I love the diversity of the work that I did. My firm was always up from pro bono. They let me go for summers in South Africa to teach during apartheid, in black law schools. They didn't care. They said, as long as you have a good story to tell when you come back, it's fine with us, right? So I wasn't going to go to a corporation and be in-house. And then I came home and I explained to my wife that they'd made this offer, but I was going to graciously decline. And I think she said, you know, basically, I don't want to tell you how to run your business, but you probably don't want to turn this opportunity down. And I have to say, she was right.
Again.
Again, exactly. You know, so being compliant in this case actually worked out for me.
How did you find your preparation in law firm life to have worked being in-house?
You know, I think at the beginning it was, for me, very hard, to be honest, because I represented multiple clients in multiple areas of law. And then you come in-house and you're representing one client, and it feels awfully repetitive in some ways. But I think that good lawyering is good lawyering, no matter where you are. And I was very fortunate. I mentioned, for example, the first case that I ever had in private practice, my client was Bill Coleman. It was a lawsuit over a real estate conveyance that Bill had done. And the plaintiff had the temerity to argue that Bill's lawyering was not up to snuff. And you know that's not true. I like to tell this story because I was very fortunate to have Bill as a mentor throughout my career. But this was a cut and dried case. The language at issue in this real estate conveyance had been litigated many times. The Supreme Court of Pennsylvania had said foursquare that this particular language should be construed in a particular way. And I wrote a memo for Bill Coleman, and I said, we get summary judgment, we win. And he called me into his office, and he said, why do you think the Pennsylvania Supreme Court is correct? Thought that had never occurred to me, right? Because I thought because I had precedent saying that I get summary judgment that I'd done my job. And anybody who knows Bill knows that that was just an opportunity to begin to explore the English common law of real property. And what I learned from that was, essentially this stuff we call stare decisis, this common law. Those things are the law until a lawyer is clever enough to make a better argument for why the law should be something different. And I tell that story to say that, very early in my career, I had experience with tremendous giants in the law. I was a partner in my firm whose name is Henry Sawyer. You don't have to know his name, but he litigated the prayer in public school case in the Supreme Court. He litigated the parochial school funding case in the Supreme Court. So when you're surrounded by these people who, reach the heights of the law, in many ways, all I've been doing my entire life is imitating people.
Were there some skills that you had before going to Merck that you wish you had further burnished? Were there skills you wish you had had that you didn't have when you went to Merck? So
I would say that, when I went to Merck, one of the most important things that I had to learn on the fly was finance, right? So I was a word person. I wasn't a numbers person. And you go inside, and you're facing spreadsheets with number after number and column after column and row after row. That was, for me, in the beginning, intimidating. It's sort of like learning a foreign language. But, the good thing about all of us is if we're willing to try to learn something, you can learn it. And I found that, after a couple of years, I could start to see the patterns. The way that you look at words and you understand the words. The numbers were always hard for me because any set of numbers, if you look at a word if you see the word exit, if you look over it, you can't help but understand that pattern means exit. But numbers, each number is a different number. And so until you get used to looking at them and understanding how they're arrayed and what their meaning is, that was for me the hardest thing about being in a corporation. And the second hardest thing was being in a law firm. I didn't have a boss. And I remember when I first went to the corporation and, I settled in and somebody came and said, this is your boss. I remember thinking, what? What is this boss stuff? I mean, I knew I had a boss at home. But other than that, I didn't think I had any boss.
That leads naturally to the inquiry about managing people.
Yes.
And what sense did you have about your law firm experience that was either relevant or irrelevant to the task of learning to manage people in the corporate setting?
Well, I did think that the experience that I had in the law firm was really helpful because when I left, I was one of the people who was responsible for assigning work and evaluating associates in the litigation department. So I had a little bit of it. They didn't work directly for me, but I had a lot of experience in working with lawyers, and so supervising lawyers was something that I was used to. But, shortly after I arrived in the legal department, the then CEO of Merck called me into his office and said, I don't want you to spend any more time in the legal department. That was about 1 year after coming, and he said, I think you should leave and go into the business. And I'll never forget, I said to him, but I'm a lawyer and I'd like to contribute to Merck in my own discipline. And he looked at me and he said, that's probably the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. And I look back on that again, and that was a formative decision point in my life where I love the law. I'm still a lawyer. I think of myself as a lawyer, but I'm not just a lawyer. And he forced me into the business. So for the next 6 or 7 years, I was not in the legal department.
And did you find differences in climate between the general counsel's office and the business side of the company to be significant, and if so, how?
Well, I think they were very different, and I think that, first of all, the lawyers walk around with a strong feeling of responsibility for the company's reputation, for protecting the assets of the company, including the people of the company. In some ways, when I went back into the legal department, I would describe it as being sort of the adult supervision in the company. And the business people, they have targets that they have to make, pressures, they have numbers that they have to make. And, there's a healthy tension, I think, between the lawyers and the business people, where in the ideal situation, the lawyers are constraining the business people's enthusiasm about things, because often business plans only work if 100% of the assumptions work. On the other hand, I think the business people challenge the lawyers because just avoiding risk doesn't make a company successful. You have to accept some quantum of risk, particularly in our business where we fail 93% of the time.
How many blacks are currently CEOs of Fortune 500 companies?
I thought you were going to ask me that, and I did that research before I came. According to Fortune magazine, 3 of the 500 CEOs now are African-American CEOs. Myself, Roger Ferguson, and Marvin Ellison of JCPenney. So we are very scarce, less than 1%.
And to pursue that, what do you think the outlook is for racial, ethnic, gender diversity in the upper levels of U.S. business?
So I'd like to be optimistic. The trends are not positive. I think it was just a few years ago there were 7 African-American CEOs. We're now down to 3. As I travel around, my fear is that there's not a lot of people in the pipeline. I think that there was a period of time when there was a level of management where this whole commitment towards diversity was a stronger commitment than my sense is that it may be in a lot of companies today. I think our society is one where there's a huge amount of complexity around these issues now, and I think saying that you want diversity has enormous rhetorical appeal. But when you actually look at what many companies are doing, you don't see action following that.
You've done a number of things outside of your business career, and I want to talk about a couple of them with you. One has to do with your alma mater, Penn State, and the Jerry Sandusky sexual abuse scandal and the firing of the football coach, Joe Paterno. Tell us about that.
Well, so I was a new board member at the time the grand jury report came out about the child sexual abuse at Penn State. And so, like many of my fellow board members, I was totally shocked by that. And then he looked around the room, and I remember someone said, well, who should we choose to run the internal investigation in the task force? And I remember sitting on my hands because this is 2011, and I was a brand new CEO at that time. So the last thing I needed was something like that put on my lip. And I remember one of my fellow board members said, well, is there anybody in this room who's ever handled the Vioxx litigation? And it was pretty clear that I couldn't hide at that point. And so I was asked to take that on. That was only a semi-serious comment, but I was asked to take that on. It was one of the hardest things that I've ever done in my entire life. It was, I'm trying to say this in the right way. Joe Paterno was an icon and a legend for really legitimate reasons. There will never be another person like Coach Paterno, who coached at one school for 60 years. On the other hand, it was manifestly clear that children were sexually abused and that there was, at least in the grand jury report, enough evidence to be concerned that people who are in a position to prevent further child sexual abuse did not take the steps necessary to prevent that. And so the board had to make some very difficult decisions with highly imperfect information. Many of our alums will never forgive us for the decisions that we've made, even though I think subsequent events have shown that there was complicity, at least at certain levels of the senior management of the university. And I will say it was one of the hardest things that I've ever dealt with because the emotions there were so incredibly raw that it was very hard to get people to a point where they could see the same things and the same patterns. In my case, though, I really thought the issue around child welfare trumped everything else.
6 years later, you were a member of the President's American Manufacturing Council. And then Charlottesville became an infamous word in our language. Mm-hmm. And you had a reaction to it. Tell us about it.
Well, what I remember about that was that my wife and I were shopping for furniture in New York when the president's comments on that Saturday came out. And because we were shopping for furniture, I was paying even more close attention to my iPhone than I normally did. And when the president's first comments came out about Charlottesville, immediately I said to Andrea, I have to get off this business council. Now, to take a step back, the unfortunate thing about our country is we're so deeply divided. And when the president asked me to join the business council, I had to think very hard about joining it. It was harder to go on than to go off in many ways because, many of my friends, my two adult children were, Dad, what are you doing to us? But in that moment, when I read the comments that the president made, it was really clear that if I stayed, it would be sort of, in my view anyway, a tacit approval of what was said and what was not said. And when you run a company like Merck, you always have to think about your institutional responsibility. And, there were people who would say to withdraw from the president's council, particularly this president's council, might bring reprisal. On the other hand, I think we as Americans, particularly we as lawyers, have to take strong stands about the things that we say are our fundamental values. And for me, it was really clear that I needed to step off the council. The hard thing was I had to call an emergency board meeting because I wanted my board members to know that I preferred to say that I was doing it as a matter of my own personal conscience, but also in vindication of the company's values. But I said to the board, if you don't want me to mention Merck, I won't mention Merck, but I'm off the council. I'm not asking your permission to get off the council. I am saying if you'd like me not to say anything as the CEO of Merck, I'm willing to say it as a matter of personal conscience. And I have to say I'm very proud that unanimously they said, we want you to speak to the company's values as well as to your own personal values. So I stepped off. I got tweeted at a little bit. But the other side of that is, I'll never forget that Saturday evening, my son, who was in college not far from our house at Lehigh University, came home. And I remember, when kids are really emotional about issues, they can go to the core of, asking piercing questions. And he asked me the following question. He said, Dad, what's up? What's up? Which was his way of saying, all this stuff you've been saying about values and principles, now we're going to see where you stand.
You recently wrote about the inequities facing the poor and disadvantaged in the civil and criminal justice system. And you pointed to the stake that business has in championing legal aid and fostering efficient and fair justice. What is the business case for equal justice under law?
I would say that, first of all, businesses, like all citizens, have a responsibility for vindicating the values that we claim to have as a country. And, justice is the foremost value of all of the values that we have. It's right there at the beginning of our Constitution. It's emblazoned over the Supreme Court. I think it's naive to think that businesses can have a legal system that works for them, that protects their patents, that protects their trademarks, that protects their contracts, but that the average citizen doesn't have the protection, equal access under the law. I think the biggest asset that companies like Merck have is the public's trust. And the biggest challenge we have is when there's distrust. I mean, I don't mean to point at them, but you look at where Boeing is today, and you look at, for example, where Facebook is today, and you can see what happens in the life of a company where the public begins to wonder whether the company is worth or is trustworthy. I think if we're going to have a legal system that protects our rights, then the citizens have to believe that it equally protects their rights, and it can't protect their rights if they don't have meaningful access to it. And they can't have meaningful access to it in a system where people are, need lawyers if they're not lawyers available. So this is my little pitch for why it is that companies really need to support legal services and legal aid because, again, you look at what happens in certain places around the world, look at Venezuela, look at other places where people begin to believe that they don't have a stake. It could happen here. We saw what happened in Ferguson, Missouri here. When people begin to think that they don't have access to justice, that's a bad day for all of us, including corporations.
There's something called Merck for Mothers. What is that?
So a few years ago, as a company, we all said, Merck has a history of doing things that we're not required to do because we want to be a force for good in terms of health around the world. And we decided that this contemporary generation of Merck people should take on the issue of preventable maternal mortality. And, right here in New York City, for example, an African-American woman is something like 6 times more likely to die in childbirth than a white woman. And it doesn't matter what her income is, and it doesn't matter what her educational level is. And there's a lot of evidence out there that a few interventions can actually prevent a lot of maternal mortality. A lot of it is either from hemorrhaging or spikes in blood pressure in the brain. And we decided to devote $500 million over 10 years to seeing if, in a concentrated way, we could do something about preventable cases of maternal mortality. And we've seen that happen in places where we have put that focus. And around the world in poor places, India, sub-Saharan Africa, often when a mother dies, the whole family dies. And so for us, this is the kind of thing that we want to do. We're very proud, by the way, that we've been able to come up with a heat-stable version of the drug that's used around the world that prevents this hemorrhaging. It used to have to be refrigerated, and therefore it was no value in places like Africa where you didn't have a cold chain. So that's the kind of thing that we're trying to do. By the way, I also said we're very proud of our Ebola vaccine. Not to be it's another example of the kind of thing that you don't do because you think you're going to make a profit. But it was the kind of example of something that the public came to us, the government came to us. This was an issue that was sufficiently analogous to the work that we were already doing in our vaccine research that the question became whether we were really putting up the capital to actually develop an Ebola vaccine. And we're very proud that the vaccine that's out in the field, and 87,000 vaccinations have occurred in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We're very proud to be able to say that we think we've done something to save a lot of people's lives.
What trends in law practice worry you?
I can tell you the one that worries me the most is this trend towards hyperspecialization. I admire lawyers like you, Conrad. We were talking about this before we came in. The Conrad Harpers of the world. I'm on the Council of the American Law Institute, and I've watched him preside over the discussions of a wide variety of substantive legal areas. And, I had great admiration for a person like Bill Coleman. It's hard to develop those lawyers today because I think, and again, I hope I'm not offending anybody in the room, I think when I came along in the private practice of law in 1978 and came into a large law firm, it was expected that I would do a rotation throughout the different departments of the firm and before settling in on my major, which was going to be litigation. And now I talk to these young kids, and The area of practice that they have is incredibly narrow. And I can say, as a consumer of legal services on the other end, what I have seen is lawyers are no longer treated as the wise people in the room. They're not viewed as counselors in the same way. They're more viewed as technicians. And it's horrifying to me that my business colleagues think they should get advice from McKinsey. Or worse yet, I don't mean to pick on any, Goldman Sachs, right? And I think one of the reasons is because people perceive lawyers as being incredibly narrow. So I think what may have justified the fee structure in firms has created a situation where, as lawyers, we've just gotten too narrow. I hope I didn't offend anybody.
Well, let's hope maybe that question by asking the obverse, what trends in law practice do you applaud?
Well, I think the thing that I'm happiest about is my sense of it is that in today's society, I think lawyers are coming to the rescue of our democracy. I think when we see what's happening in our society today, what's happening in our political discourse, it's great when you see lawyers show up at airports to represent people who are otherwise going to be turned away, or lawyers volunteering to make sure that children are reunited with their families. My sense of it is that there's now a movement happening in our profession where lawyers are standing up and saying, we are going to make sure that our fundamental values are vindicated. That's the thing that I'm happiest about. And that's, by the way, why all of us went to law school. Not all of us, but those of us who did go to law school. And that's the thing that actually makes me most proud to be a lawyer.
And if you had it to do all over again, what would you do differently?
That's a good question. What would I do differently? That's a very good question. Well, I would have married my wife earlier. I would have listened to her more. I would have obeyed her more. And as for my career, I don't regret anything. I had a 15-year career in a law firm in Philadelphia, and I loved every minute of it. And now I've had a 27-year career at Merck, and I've enjoyed that too.
Well, on that note, we thank you. And now let me ask whether there are questions from the audience.
Hopefully hard ones.
Yes, sir.
Is a mic coming?
My name is Justin Lee. I'm a fifth year at Whiting Case. Kind of harping on your question here. I was wondering if during the tough times, obviously to get to the level where you're at today, you had to go through a lot of tough times.
Yes.
And so my question to you are, do you have any mantras, sayings, things that you remind yourself? Because, all of us have times where, we're down, we're busy, we're swamped. But things that you say that kind of pick you up, things you think about or tell your kids when they're going through a tough time, something like that would be great.
Okay, so first of all, I never try to tell my kids anything because it's really clear that anything I say will actually cause the opposite reaction. So I don't do that. But to your question, actually, I started here, and I'll end, with this. I feel extremely blessed to have had the parents that I had. I think in a lot of ways, most of us have never had an original thought in our lives. And my father brainwashed his children to succeed. He believed, I don't want to bore you with this whole story, but, he was 47 years old when he paid his admission and went into what was then called Shibe Park in Philadelphia and saw Jackie Robinson on the diamond playing for the Dodgers. And he would point to Jackie as an exemplar of individual excellence. And he would tell us the stories. Do you know what he had to go through? Anybody who knows about Jackie Robinson, Jackie Robinson's forte was stealing home plate. Mm-hmm. It was the thing that he was known for, And my father would always use him. He would say, stealing home plate is so mental. It's about being tough because the pitcher is looking at you when you decide to steal home plate. And Jackie's whole thing was to walk halfway down the baseline and dare the pitcher to throw the ball behind him. And so that was my father's view, was that, frankly, people will try to stop you, he would say. But there's only one question, and here it is, Kenny, he would say, can you be stopped? That's the only question. And so I think that I hear my father in my ear. This man scrubbed floors for a living. And sometimes I do feel the pressure of being inside Merck. But I could hear him now, wait a minute. I read the proxy statement. You ain't scrubbing no floors. You aren't breaking your back. You wear a nice suit and a Hermes tie. How bad can it be? And so I guess I would answer your question by saying I feel very fortunate that I've had that. And also my home was a very religious home, and there was a concept that we're here for a bigger purpose.
A question over here? Yes, ma'am.
Hello, I'm Jenny Gashiri. I'm an AUSA and SDNY.
Yes.
I have two questions for you. So my first question is, most people look at you and think you have it made, right? You love a job that you have at a company you lead. You have a wonderful wife. I'm wondering, what are your next professional and personal goals? What's next for you?
Well, I have to tell you, I am looking forward to the next chapter. I really am. It's been a nice run at Merck. I think Merck has been a force for good in the world. But I think there's a wisdom in term limits. And I've been CEO now for 9 years. And I have to tell you, it's an overrated experience being CEO of Merck in some ways. And I really look forward to coming out and doing something in public service. That's what I really want to do. I haven't decided what it is, but I have to say, every time I talk to Sherilyn, I feel like she's got the greatest job in the world at the LDF. So I'm not sure exactly what it is. I also have this feeling, I started by talking about being on those buses, riding 90 minutes to white schools, which were good schools. I have this feeling that in our society, we have to do something so that kids who are born in my neighborhood don't have to, by accident of social policy, have to ride a bus for 90 minutes to get a good education. Because in some ways, I have that imposter syndrome. Why was I the kid on the bus? I don't believe I was more talented than the other kids in my neighborhood. I just know that in those days, the concept of school desegregation was not integrating the schools. It was making sure that the best schools were not 100% white. And by the way, I was looking at the data the other day about Stuyvesant, and out of 900 kids admitted, only 7 being black. And without getting into that in a great detail, that is the issue that I care the most about. Because when I look back at my life, I realize how fortunate I was to be on that bus. And what a coincidence it was, in the sense that my next oldest brother, who was only 2 years older, he didn't come along when that was the fad. There was nobody saying, put him on the bus. All right? I was put on the bus in 1963. I wonder whether the March on Washington had an impact on the social engineers in Philadelphia. So, I don't know if I answered your question.
Someone in this area?
There's
No one?
a
Okay.
gentleman right here, too, who's
Okay.
was the first one with his hands up.
We'll take you, and then we'll take you. Yes, sir.
First, a comment. You very much need to take this dog and pony show on the road to a high school, a college, and a law school at least twice a year. This is a fantastic
Thank you for saying that.
program, and thank you. But I have a question about the level of corruption in American capitalism. We have bad debt ratios. We know how many Americans pay their taxes honestly. I remember when I was a kid in grammar school, my teacher told me that the reason America was more successful in Europe was because 70% of our people paid their taxes honestly, and in Europe only 30%. We have international organizations that measure corruption in countries and say this country is more successful because it's less corrupt, et cetera. Is there any comparable measure for corruption in American capitalism? Is corruption in American capitalism better than it was, worse than it was, the same as it was? What's your sense of it, having been where you've been?
That's a great question. I lack the historical context to answer where we've gone, I have to say, I do believe that there are many people who run business firms for whom maximizing profit is what they most care about, and they don't necessarily care about the means in which they do it. I always say to people when they complain about regulation, I want to live in a regulated world because, frankly, I think we're all better off with the right measure of regulation, including, in my case, the Food and Drug Administration. I want to live in a world where every new drug gets carefully vetted by objective people. But to answer your question about corruption and capitalism, I think human beings are human beings, and I think left unchecked, there will be people who violate laws and go outside the boundaries of what they're supposed to do, and which is why I think making sure that we have an AUSA over here, we need those people, because otherwise there's a temptation to go outside the lines.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Guan Kui. I'm a trademarks lawyer.
Yes.
First of all, thank you for sharing your inspirational stories with us.
Thank you.
And then to your point about lawyers becoming hyper-specialized today, if the environment is really fostering that trend, what can we do personally to become the wise person in the room?
That's a very good question. When I was coming along, the pressure to specialize was just starting, and it's much worse now. But I do think that just being aware of what you want to do in your career and making sure that you broaden yourself to the greatest extent possible is really, really important. There are not many Conrad Harpers around anymore. I say this with all honesty and directness. He is the kind of wise person that people can come to and get the kind of counsel that they need. Not just legal counsel, but business counsel, interpersonal counsel. I think if you're growing up in the world in which we practice now, I just think it's harder. But I don't think you have to be a victim of whatever environment you're in. I have to say that one of the things that I learned inside Merck when I left the legal department was that a lot of people inside the company have really deep knowledge in a particular area. And as I went from place to place within Merck, I had to get over the fact that I didn't have that depth of knowledge. My spouse used to say, don't say you're ignorant, say you're unencumbered by orthodoxy. And so I find myself in a position now, having been in marketing, having been in finance, having been in legal, having been in policy and government affairs, I think I'm now in a position to be the integrator inside the company. My colleagues know so much more about their area than I could ever hope to know, but often they don't know anything about the area right next to them. And I think, having looked back on it, I think the CEO who took me out of the legal department in my first year did me a great favor, because basically what he was saying is, if you keep practicing law, we brought you to be the next general counsel, but if you spend the next 5 or 6 years polishing your legal skills, that's not really going to help you. What's going to help you is to understand the business and what drives the business. And so I would say to you, fight against the tyranny of specialization.
I think we have time for one more question. Ma'am, in the back row there. And then we'll take you, sir.
Okay.
You'll be the last.
Hi, my name is Wei Wei. Thank you, Ken, for sharing your stories, and thank you, Conrad. My question is, what is one of the most difficult situations you have been in, and what are the criteria or factors you have considered to get you through that situation?
So I'm going to refer to a business situation. When I first came to the CEO job, it was at a period of time where Wall Street was really criticizing expenditures on R&D. And it had been a long period of time in the pharmaceutical industry where productivity was really bad. And, I became CEO at a time when the pressure to cut the R&D budgets was immense. And, everybody wants to be liked, including by your shareholders and in your board. But I made the decision 25 days into my tenure as CEO to withdraw long-term earnings guidance, which had 3 years remaining. And I can tell you that does not make you popular with anybody, except for the researchers who said, this guy really cares about what this company's about. And I think when I look back on that, I don't want to pat myself on the back. I did the right thing for the right reason. I knew what this company was about was the science, and I just had to tune out all the critics. And now we're doing relatively well as a company. And those same critics are saying, weren't we smart for not cutting the R&D budget? So I would say that, this is the last thing that I'm going to say about my father. But the single most important piece of advice I've ever been given in my entire life, my father gave me when I was around 13, 14 years old, growing up in the inner city of Philadelphia and struggling with being popular. The story was that when I was 13, 14 years old, athletic shoes converted from high-top canvas shoes to leather shoes. And I came home one night and I said to my father, I'm not going to play basketball anymore because out on the basketball court, I'm the last kid with these high-top canvas shoes, and everybody makes fun of me. And my father said, oh, that's terrible, Kenny. They're making fun of you. He said, I should give you money to buy these shoes so you'll be popular. All right? And he said, go up and get my wallet. And I'm walking up the stairs, and I'm thinking, what alien has taken over my wallet? Because I'd never seen empathy in the man before, right? So I come downstairs, and he's counting out the money. I shouldn't probably tell this story, but I'll tell you exactly what happened. He was counting out the money, and he sternly was saying to me, I need to give you this money so that you can be popular, and the other boys will think highly of you, and the girls won't make fun of you, and you'll be popular. And I'm like, yeah. And he was counting out the money, and he slid it across the table, and I reached for it. That was a trap. He grabbed my hand. This little man jumped up, and let me just say that he patted me lightly on my head. And when I got up off the floor, he said the single most important sentence that has ever been uttered in my life, and here it is. He said, Kenny, what other people think about you is none of your damn business. And the sooner you learn that, he said, the better off you'll be. If you need it to be popular, damn it, you can't have it, okay? And to the point of these hard decisions, I hear him, right? The critics are all around you, right? You shouldn't withdraw from this situation with the president because you'll be tweeted at, right? Or you shouldn't withdraw the guidance because those mean people with those poison pens on Wall Street will call you names. I can hear him now saying, that's none of your damn business. And I think that people don't really get that.
Sir, you have the last question.
So much for your remarks, which are so heartening and inspiring. This is a variation on the popularity question, but you spoke just a moment ago about people who are driven by profit and don't necessarily care how they get there. In listening to you speak, I realize you deal with all these audiences all the time, and you have a message which is all about being values-driven and changing what a lot of people do. And so this question has two parts that fit together. The first is, what's the reception when you go to all these places that aren't here at the New York City Bar Association, where I think probably to a person we love listening to your remarks? And then are you at all interested in running for national office?
Sure. So I'll answer the second question because that's really clear. No. And actually, what's interesting? I think there's a lot of receptivity to what I'm trying to say, even in the business community. To the question that was asked earlier on, I think the capitalism system, free markets, innovation, profits within limits, it's the best economic engine for wealth creation in the world. But it doesn't include everybody. And I think that the gaps that exist in our society, the income disparities in our society, are now at a point where the center is not going to hold much longer. And frankly, I say to other business people that if you look at our society today, our schools are more segregated than they've ever been. Most of us live in enclaves of people that are like us. The media we consume, whether it's broadcast media or social media, we usually go to tune in because we're going to talk to and hear from people who already agree with us. I actually believe that the workplace is almost the last place in American society where people cannot choose who they interact with. And I think the role of business in our society in vindicating values, because it used to be when I grew up, we looked up to the President of the United States as a paragon of how we should behave, right? That was like the teacher in the classroom in this big experiment that we have. I don't want to be too political, but I do think what's happening in our political discourse is destructive of our society. I think the income inequality is destructive of our society. And I do think this concept of reminding people of what our fundamental values is, people hear it, and I can tell you that the younger people in particular care very much where they work, and they want to know that that company's values are consistent with their values.
Thank you very much, Ken.
Thank you, Conrad.
Thank you particularly to Ken and to Conrad. Thank you all, and please join us for a reception next door, and you can continue the conversation.